without further ado, I'm so excited to have Chantal here today. She will give you some more of her background, but just a little story. I love stories. I reached out to Chantal over a year ago. I think I'd seen her speak on something, and I was just like fangirling over here on LinkedIn and messaged and asked to catch up, and just so gracious as a real leader in the industry to take time and give me some amazing feedback on what we were building. Just so insightful. And she was the first person I wanted to have this conversation with here today. So I'm excited to share her with all of you if you don't know her yet. And without further ado, Chantal, I would love for you to kick us off by introducing yourself and just sharing a few layers of your identity that are most important to you.
Mitch, it's so great to have this catch up, a reunion. I hope you'll also share a little bit about what's going on with you in our conversation today. I'm Chantal Forster. You can also call me Coco if you want. That's my nickname. I serve as the executive director of the Tech Association of Grantmakers. So our members are foundations throughout North America, the EU, the UK, and staff at those foundations who either lead tech, work in a tech-related role, or are funding tech. And then also we have as our members a number of consultants and product providers and vendors who work in the philanthropic space.
Amazing. And what did you, thinking back 30 years, did you think that you were going to be leading a big philanthropy organization? Where did this story of impact and kind of your love story with impact start for you?
You know, it's funny, you talked a second ago about identity, Mitch, and I think for me, well, I did not know this is what I was going to do. But I did know I've always been someone who wants to get things done. I also have been someone who's always lived on the infrastructure side of cities. So I grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago. My father he was a computer scientist doing automation for the steel mills along the southern Great Lakes. My grandfather was a metallurgical engineer. So I spent my whole life working on the infrastructure side, seeing I think of sometimes the guts of greatness. Chicago is one of the great world cities, and I didn't live on the fancy side. I lived on the infrastructure side of the city, growing up near the train tracks and the steel mills and all the things that are required to pull off a lot of what we consider to be the greatness in our society. So that's a really strong part of my identity. And then I also think something that is relevant for me, and I want to share this for anyone who is thinking about their role in the nonprofit space and in the STEM space. I am thrilled to see that we're talking about things like gender as a spectrum. When I was growing up, I had a great deal of discomfort with what was considered the kind of dominant narrative for what it meant to be a female. I've never said this out loud before, but I kind of have always thought of myself as 80% female, right? Just because I didn't see anything that matched me when I was growing up. And so I'm so grateful that we have a great deal more fluidity now. I'm inspired by things like my daughter. I have a 14-year-old stepdaughter. She said to me a couple of years ago, she said, Coco, there are girly girls and then there are tomboys. And she had internalized this here's the polarities. And she said, Coco, I don't think I'm any of those. I think what I am is an adventure girl. And I was like, this is amazing. This is the world that I want to live in, that I want all of us to find our place in, where you've got this whole spectrum of ways to look at yourself. And so I think I want to mention that, Mitch, because it's important to me as a woman who spent her whole career in tech, that we've got a whole range of ways to look at ourselves and our gender and our place in our careers and in society.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm here at Pond, our CTO and my co-founder, Kiara Anderson, and I have talked about this a lot, the realities of being a woman in technology and finding your way in engineering where it doesn't feel like there's a clean cut box for you. And the most helpful thing is having visible, vocal leaders that you can identify with. And it's important to share that. So thank you.
Good. Well, if another identity, if anyone wants to be a falconer when they grow up, I would really like to be a falconer one day. That's my next career move, I think.
Oh, I love that. I have never met a falconer before, so if you do, I'll send them your way.
Good.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all that personal background, Chantal, and I think it would be helpful framing for people just in case they're not familiar with the organization that you lead. If you could give a little bit of background on TAG, the history of the organization. It's been around for over 15 years. What was the context within that group started 15 years ago?
Mhm. So I'm the second executive director of TAG. I joined in 2018. When the organization started, it was an affinity group of the Council on Foundations. There were a great deal of affinity groups at that time, and the role of tech was somewhat nascent in the sector. And so it was a small group of people, and eventually there was enough momentum. They broke off from the Council on Foundations and formed TAG. The first, I'm told the first TAG conference was in 2006, was in Baltimore. And I think there were like 38 people there. So we now have over 3,000 members from 400 foundations throughout the world. And so it's grown, it's come a long way. At the same time, we've never lost, I think, our sense of focus. So there are some orgs that, are in an expansion mode or trying to, serve a different role in the sector. TAG knows what our role is. We serve the role of technology to advance the mission of philanthropy. I think that that's changed over time. When I joined, we thought about, promoting the use of tech in philanthropy. We now have updated our mission and we focus on the strategic, equitable, and innovative use of technology to further the mission of philanthropy. So I look at tech as a means to an end, not the end in itself. I'm not in love with tech like, we need to become, buy the latest and install the latest and integrate and implement the latest just for that sake. We are a means to an end that the philanthropic sector seeks.
And you mentioned even how things have changed since you joined a few years ago to now. Do you remember when you joined? And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you prior had spent almost or entirely your career was in for-profit technology roles. So could you just share a little bit about what that transition was like and what you were thinking when you came into that job?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to know what you think too, Mitch. So I started in private sector. I was working at a SPSS. It's a predictive analytics firm. They got bought by IBM. I was the lead tech writer for the data mining platform. I then worked in the public sector and I ran digital for the mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I ran digital for the Pioneers and then ended up in the, that was a nonprofit, and then moved deeper into the social sector. We started with identity, right? And we started with, I'm a person who gets things done. So I got to be honest, moving from private sector to public sector and then to social sector, there were times when I felt like my work life was coming to a screeching halt. I was used to a very different pace of work. There is a focus on the customer that has a way of sharpening your focus and your momentum. In the public sector, we were focused on the citizen. It was still about 3 times as slow as the private sector. And then the social sector was even 3 times slower, in part because, at least on the philanthropic side, I think we struggle with who is our customer. Do we actually serve the nonprofit needs? I mean, that's part of what we're going to talk about today, because if those nonprofit needs are boring and unsexy, like maybe tech, are we willing to fund them or not? So I think we'll go deeper, but I don't know, Mitch, if you found something similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, and for background for folks on the line today, I was an investment banker for 7 years, covered technology, but both tech and serving the nonprofit sector were new for me. But I had a lot of passion for the causes I'd worked with and wanted to translate that into my day job. And I think it's just been a really steep learning curve of that's not enough. You need to really get into like you said, the customer focus. That has been what I try to spend all of my time on, is better understanding the challenges people in the space face, even if it might sound like it's not just how do I find a vendor, being attuned to the broader context of the challenges they're facing, and not putting us in a box of what we can address. And I think that's what spurred a lot of the discussions even we're having this month of like, there's so much more going on. We need to, it's all connected and tied together. And if we're not addressing that broader, the broader situation, then we're missing the nuance of the work. So I think I underappreciated all of that nuance. And I also think so many people come into this space thinking like, oh, maybe you had some of these thoughts too, like, oh, I'm going to bring all of the great things from my nonprofit experience and like make this better because I've heard that it's slower. And I actually think there's a lot more to be done in the reverse direction, where like all of the attributes and values of nonprofit work in particular probably could be better appreciated and institutionalized in big corporations too, which I think really gets missed.
Right. There's an inclusion in, the consensus culture of nonprofits, I think could really cross-pollinate in the other direction. I think that there is much to learn about the inclusion of voices in our design, program design from a tech perspective, right? Also the design, the UX design, but there is a genuine openness to hearing a multiplicity of voices that I think the private sector could also benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what our conversation is today, we titled it Removing Stigma, because I do think there really, and I'm sure when you took on this job felt the same way, that there really was too much stigma around these things like technology and overhead. Can you talk a little bit about how you saw that stigma when you came into the job, or how you kind of identify the roots of that stigma?
Well, we've made so much progress. I don't even know if I want to think back to the beginning, but it is helpful. It's helpful to deconstruct because we have a moment post-pandemic. But if we don't really seize that moment, that window may close to fund the kind of operational overhead, including things like tech for nonprofits. So I think that historically, a couple of things. I think that there was a lack of awareness about what it about the tech needs to run a mission-oriented organization. Everyone had a phone, everyone had a computer or a laptop, but they appeared now so easy to use that not everyone was aware of what it took to pull that off. The specialization around user experience, project management, business analysis, right? The specialization of the skills and investment of time and budget to design something, whether that's a system to support a nonprofit or an app for beneficiary services, for example. TAG has some interesting data that will shed some light here. We do our annual State of Philanthropy Tech Survey. It's biannual, pardon me. It's open right now, actually. And one of the findings we saw was that for community foundations, their executives were the most supportive of the role of the IT leader. So the CEOs of community foundations, more supportive than any other type of foundation about their IT leader or staff, but they were less knowledgeable about technology broadly. So more supportive, but less knowledgeable. And so that creates kind of a perfect storm of, well, how do I advocate for budget and staff if they're not aware of the complexity of what it takes to pull off infrastructure in 2022? I think another thing is that we have a false dichotomy between people and mission, people and mission versus tech, or relationship versus tech. We're hearing a lot right now about relational philanthropy. And one of the things I try to push for is a third way of thinking about that. It's not relationship versus tech. It's tech to save time so that you can have more relationship, or it's tech to streamline and focus so that your relationships can be more authentic. They're not at odds. I mean, they can be at odds. It depends on how you use them. So I think that has created this perfect storm that we're in. There's also, when we talk about funding tech, we're talking about funding individual nonprofits, but we're also talking about funding a baseline of infrastructure for the sector. That latter category around investing in technology is a tough one, because if you're trying to invest in let's say, data platform where nonprofits can share data that gets fed into a common grant application like we do in higher ed, right? If you're trying to do something like that, what does that ask of foundations? Ooh, it asks that they streamline grant apps and share like a core set of questions. It asks that they maybe standardize on outcome measurements, so on and so forth. And are funders willing to do that? So I think when you really get down to the heart of the matter about moving beyond just writing a check, but investing in shared infrastructure, there's some soul searching that we have yet to do.
Yeah, and it's funny because you even used this language earlier of like, it might not be the sexiest thing ever, which I know we all kind of like use that term in jests, but like, why do you think that is? Like, I think it's super exciting and incredible what tech can offer, especially when you're thinking about wanting to have more impact and serve more people and scale your mission. Why do you think that exists, that perspective?
It's I'm thinking back to a funny story from the mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Like most cities, there's kind of open office hours, right? And you can go and talk to the mayor, especially if you're a city of like 1 million, on the smaller side. So we'd have open office hours. People would wait in line to talk to the mayor about a big problem. And if there was something that hit the news or something he perceived that he'd done kind of wrong or the team had done wrong, the line would be like down the hallway of people wanting to talk to him. And at one point I had to say, Mayor Marty, I know that you see this long line of people. While you're looking at that long line of people, meanwhile, there are 40,000 people on your website trying to pay their water bill, and they can't do it because we haven't updated the app, and we really need the, water department to help us, blah, 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 to pull it off. I think it's because it's invisible. I think the tech infrastructure is invisible to people, and therefore it maybe doesn't matter as much as investing in a community center or a library. We simply can't see it.
Yeah, the brick, like the building, feel it, like the person. Yeah, and I hadn't thought about it in that way. And I think understanding why it receives that perspective probably helps us, right? Because if it's that visibility, then you can think about framing the needs and the investment in ways that make it more visible and tangible. Like, have you seen that play out for folks?
Well, what I ended up doing for the, I'm seeing this in philanthropy, but what I ended up doing at the city of Albuquerque to continue that story, I created dashboards for the city councilors so they could see at any given time how many people were on the website and what they were doing. Now, there was de-identified, so there was no private information, but they just simply needed to see how many people were using this infrastructure at any given time and what their priorities were at any given time. So we made the invisible visible. And I know some funders who are doing that in a similar fashion.
Yeah, and something that you touched on earlier that I just like can't stop thinking about too is philanthropy, meaning, and I feel like it's good for us to be specific with terms here. When we're saying philanthropy, and I know your primary audience are funders, they are the people that are writing grants, and not understanding their customer, like who do they serve? Are they serving the source of wealth that's funding the philanthropy? And what is their incentive to do better, right? Is it like, is our best bet like a hearts and minds campaign? Like that, I think there's some really interesting kind of tension there that I'd love to hear how. I'm sure you've had hard conversations with people around this in the past. Like, what is it that moves people forward in this respect?
Mitch, you are a dangerous person. You have a way of getting right to the heart of the matter, don't you?
I try.
the lever, what are the levers of change in the philanthropic sector? There are very few drivers. Reputational risk is one very real driver, reputational risk. The obvious permanent driver is maintaining your tax status, getting enough money out the door in order to meet that. That and reputational risk are the two long-standing drivers in philanthropy. We have a moment, one of my members said late last year, that we have a new driver right now. And that's the rise in the voices of the people we serve. This was at the Tag Reconnect event in San Francisco. And one of the members said, we have a moment. The rise in the voices of the people we serve has become a lever for change in philanthropy.
Mm.
Tag, just earlier this week, I was at the United Philanthropy Forum teaching a workshop for organizations in this philanthropic space around customer experience, what in our sector we call change maker experience. And I was teaching people how to do journey mapping, which is a way of understanding the nonprofit's journey with your organization as a funder. And it uncovers all sorts of pain points and steps in the process you may not be aware of. We talk in philanthropy all the time about grant applications and reporting, but a nonprofit has a bunch of steps before, during, and after that most foundations aren't aware of. So I think if we can inculcate, shift, build awareness and commitment to the change maker experience in philanthropy, we might have a new driver that could be lasting. If we built new listening systems and ways to hold ourselves accountable to what key measurements, whatever that may be, reduce time to complete an application, increase time to receive check, increase renewal rate, so on and so forth, we could determine what those are. And if we held our philanthropy accountable, if we held ourselves accountable to genuinely serving the people who are accomplishing the mission, it would be a different ballgame entirely. That's what I'm aiming for. That's what I'm hoping for, and I'm working for.
Do you think that there's more safety now for people to rate, like to say when this took way too much time, or like that this was, an onerous application, or I didn't feel like we had enough information, whatever the barriers are for people? Like, what are the most effective ways for, like you mentioned, this new lever, what are the most effective ways to actually like channel that and bring it to bear?
So yes and no to that. I'm going to be candid. Yes and no. The power is still real. I think there are foundations that are, here's when to be honest. There are foundations that have included like micro reporting, like micro moments of feedback at multiple points in the process. And I would seize every one of those moments. If it's a micro moment, like right after you complete the application and they say, give you 3 questions, I would absolutely seize those moments. What I can't authentically say is that it would be wise at the end of your grant report to be as completely honest as you'd like to be. I've seen that work against me with TAG, and I don't know, just human biases are real. I don't have any data to suggest that that would work to your advantage. I would love for that feedback to be heard. So I think I'm trying to shift the sector to not wait for feedback at the end, right? When you're maybe trying to renew, because who's going to be honest then?
Right.
But micro moments, I think, would be much more helpful and avoid, recollection bias and all sorts of things like that. That would ultimately lead to genuine change.
Yeah, and I think that's as you know, from system development, like that's in tech, we know feedback is the biggest gift we could ever get. Like we're constantly trying to figure out what people's experience is like and what they need. And I think applying that to philanthropic culture would be a drastic and really powerful shift.
Yeah. What do you think how do you think we're not applying it now, Mitch, that we could? What would you recommend?
I mean, I asked that question specifically for a reason, also because I think it is a question of safety, right? And that is what's missing for, like you said, that when you said that third lever of like the voice of the people we serve, I was like, yes, agreeing. And then I got to thinking like, okay, but how do we actually make that lever accessible to people? And so, I think what groups like TAG do, when you can kind of be a face for that voice, and maybe that is an answer, right? Like that you serve as a buffer. Like, can you intake some of that feedback, which I know you already do through surveys and stuff like that, but ways for people to be heard and adequately express the extent to which this is disrupting the work that we're trying to fund.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best answer because, as you know, there's tens of thousands of these foundations around the country that different organizations, especially in smaller communities, are like so reliant upon, and they're powerless, and I think any way that we are giving them like a safe amplifier, I feel like that is the most obvious step. And then, like you said, could a foundation or a funder have anonymous ways to receive feedback and show that they want to do better? But it is hard because, like, as we're discussing, it is.
There's power in the room. There's power associated with that check. You talk about that safe buffer, and I'd be remiss not to name two very important players in that space. So N10 and TechSoup. N10 and TechSoup are really strong advocates in this space and data gatherers, which leads to, of course, becoming an amplifier for the voice of nonprofits and their needs for tech. There's some really great data out there. N10 shared that about 70% of nonprofits needed to make an additional investment in tech just to continue their operations during the pandemic. So 70% of nonprofits had to pay more, likely not grant funded, to maintain operations during the pandemic through the use of tech. So they've got some really great data. The question is, are we listening? Does that data translate to a program officer changing the way that they fund tech? So that if you do get a chance to participate in a TechSoup or N10 survey, please do. Those are some great amplifiers and a very safe buffer for you.
Do you obviously it's a somewhat biased audience because they've joined TAG, and so they clearly at least have some level of buy-in for the work that you're doing and prioritizing technology. But with the funders that you interact with, and this question just came up in the chat here, do you see grant applications changing in the treatment of tech investments? Where have you seen this work well to make it more accessible?
That's a great question. And there is good news, right? I am seeing a groundswell. I'm really seeing a groundswell in a willingness to fund tech for nonprofits, individual nonprofits, cohorts of nonprofits, also a groundswell in the willingness to fund infrastructure, shared infrastructure for nonprofits. So there's the kind of one-to-one model, and then there's the divest in a collective effort, like a common data platform, or maybe a cloud nonprofit cloud starter pack, for example. I'm seeing an increase in both. And sometimes it takes some hard messaging, like something I wrote in an op-ed for the Chronicle, maybe in January. Together with TechSoup, I'd uncovered that 40% of nonprofits, only 40% of nonprofits had invested in more sophisticated cybersecurity, like firewalls and network monitoring. So only 40% of nonprofits had invested in this, but 80% of foundations had invested in it. So you're able to go to a foundation and say, wow, you're investing in security for yourselves, but not for your nonprofits. So sometimes it's some tough messaging like that, but that opened doors. And if you can say that with love, but honesty, that message can be heard. There are some great funders. Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation started the tech team and the program team partnered under the leadership of Donnell Hammond, their IT director, to fund tech literacy, tools, strategy. And that's key, right? It's not just about funding the tool. It's about funding the skill building, the strategic use of those tools, the integration of them, and then the tools themselves.
Yeah, and we just got a message, I think direct to us in the chat, but someone had just mentioned that the Center for Effective Philanthropy runs anonymous donor grantee in one of their survey that are incredibly robust. And the DuPont Fund worked with CEP in 2019, and again this year, really good anonymous and actionable feedback. So I guess that is really good case study of what we were discussing earlier. And that's pretty low lift too, to run an anonymous survey. That's not too much effort for a funder.
The CEP, and I'm working on a blog post for the CEP. I don't know when it'll come out, but what's fun is we're talking about that the need for real-time listening, like timely listening. Most of the CEP survey instruments happen once every 2 years or once every 3 years. And so that can be tough to get timely feedback from somebody about how hard was it to apply. Well, it's 3 years later and I already got the check. So at this point, it felt pretty good.
Mm,
So I think that there is the sector is, I think both are real, right? The big picture longitudinal studies like what the CEP is doing, and then these tech implemented micro feedback moments all along the process for nonprofits to funders. And that's what philanthropy, the private sector's doing this, the public sector, they've all been doing it for 10 years. Like anyone who's been in a hospital, anyone who's been a student, higher education is focused on the student experience in ways that philanthropy is just now learning about.
mm. And you mentioned something earlier about the disparity between funders who are investing in their own tech, their own cybersecurity and these things, and the difference between how they're funding organizations. Do you find that if a funder is more invested in their own tech, though, are they more likely to then understand the needs at their grantees for similar investment, or are those two things like completely separated?
Very astute question. Here's what I am seeing. Again, I'm no expert on this. I'm just reflecting on what I see with our members. What I'm seeing are organizations that are able to bridge the divide between the program staff who write the checks and develop the strategy, and the tech staff who know what it takes to pull off, right, a safe, secure, efficient, effective organization from a tech perspective. If those two entities, where they're typically across a great divide, if those two entities start to develop a relationship, they go to lunch, they hang out at holiday parties, right? If they start to develop a relationship, that bridge gets divided and the programs team understands a little more about this, and the tech teams are invited and can then thoughtfully influence the direction of the program. This is what happened at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. Janelle Hammond was brilliant in developing this relationship and ultimately led to the creation of a tech funding program.
Mm. I love that, again, because it's such a practical suggestion that it doesn't need to be some big orchestrated shift, that maybe the different departments in your organization could start spending more time together. Because that relates back to your very first point earlier on in the chat about someone, I think you mentioned, if at community foundations, they were more likely to appreciate the role of tech, but not understand it.
Basically, great summary.
And I think that understanding comes from relationships. And so I love that as a great example. One thing that, just because you've mentioned this a few times too, that TAG operates around the world, do you see this differ in different jurisdictions, or do like the themes change depending on the parts of the world that we're in? Are there things we could be learning in the US from other jurisdictions?
Interesting. Yes, I'm trying to I'm teasing out some thoughts. I think that some of our funders based in the UK and the EU are a bit more data driven. I think they're a bit more data driven. Some of their data decision-making, analysis and decision-making platforms are more integrated, a little more sophisticated. Now I'm excluding like the Gates foundations and the larger the foundation, the larger the staff, the larger the budget, the greater the investment in this kind of stuff. The biggest difference I see, and there are values differences right now. Some of our Canadian funders and our EU and UK funders are focused on climate change. And then in the United States, we're very focused on equity. Nobody's right or wrong. This is just what I see in terms of trends and how they impact operational priorities. The biggest difference I see when it comes to tech funding is the closer the funder is to the community they serve, the more likely they are to fund this kind of work. And so if you're thinking about asking for funding, what I see is that a regional funder, a community foundation, is more likely to fund tech, or a family funder who's focused on a particular region is more likely to fund tech than a larger foundation, unless that foundation already has a program related to this. I think that those are the kinds of foundations where you can also have very honest conversations about what it needs to pull off a program, and the sophisticated tech strategy that might be needed, the need that you might need to build some tech skills on your team. I
Mhm.
think you can have those kinds of conversations with those funders. The data that I have to back up what I'm saying comes from our State of Philanthropy Tech survey in 2020. July 2020. What was going on in July 2020? Pandemic, important social crises. We saw community foundations be more likely to fund tech and tools, to open up their own IT help desks to support the needs of nonprofits. For like, how do I do a Zoom meeting, right? Community foundations were more likely to do those two things: fund tech and tools, tech and skills, and open up their own, like provide TA, right? Provide tech assistance for their nonprofits. Community foundations more likely to do that than private foundations, more likely than any other type, private or family or corporate.
Wow, I mean, it's just really powerful, I think, for people to have more efficiently be able to direct their efforts for the different needs within an organization and understand what's likely to come from those different sources. I didn't really appreciate that beforehand. I'm sure a lot of people don't. So thank you for lifting that up too. And I guess on that front of like, what is the message to funders? Like, how do we move this forward, and what's working? What's going on with TAG today? Like, what are the programs that you're most focused on, which obviously you believe are going to be the most effective?
Mm-hmm. I think that I should post in the chat. There's a link to a really great website that TAG has developed with some resources for folks. I'm going to see if I can find this right now and add it to chat. It's tagtech.org/funding tech. And there's a collection of resources there that are the culmination of some work that we did last year. So TAG partnered with Tech Impact. We had a grant from Octa for Good to create some resources for nonprofits who want to take that message to funders. And so there are example strategic plans, there are case studies of foundations that are funding tech. There are ways to self-assess what digital skills are needed when you're hiring. We hire typically for mission, but I don't know how much longer we can do that. We hire just for mission alignment to our detriment. I think in this world, you also have to include like baseline digital literacy, baseline data literacy. And I'm not saying they have to be experts, but they have to know how to like collaborate in a Google Doc, and how, you have to have some basic literacy, or your nonprofit's falling behind. Alternatively, if you can't hire for that, I would strongly urge people to develop a program to upskill new hires, just to baseline, ensure everybody who's coming in the door is baselined around data and digital literacy. So some of those resources at tagtech.org/funding tech will be very helpful for you in messaging to funders. I think that, TAG itself, our priorities for this coming year, we are trying to ensure, Mitch, what you just said about ensuring that the levers there, we're trying to ensure that this moment that we have through our collective realization of how dependent we are on tech in fulfilling our missions in 2022, I don't want to lose this moment. So TAG is working on philanthropycx.org. We're partnering with Grantbook to champion the customer experience framework, or the changemaker experience framework for philanthropy, so that we can understand whether our values shifts, whether we want to be more relational or trust-based. We need to understand if that's actually helping nonprofits. Or if we're just like patting ourselves on the back and saying, great, I'm so much more relational now as a funder, but it took my nonprofits 5 more hours per grant in order to feel more relational with me. I think we need to start implementing a framework of measuring customer or nonprofit experience in order to understand whether we're actually serving the people that we say we're serving. So that's one of the most important things we're working on. The funding tech series, we wrapped that last year. So the resources are out there, and now we're going a layer deeper to try to for foundations to hold themselves accountable to serving what it is nonprofits need, and developing the listening systems to really understand what that is. That's one thing that relates to today's topic that I thought it'd be important to share.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm sure everyone will keep their eyes peeled for what the results are there, and very exciting partnership. One other thing that I know you're involved in, and has been something that has been discussed long before I came into the sector, but the concept of a common grant application.
Mhm.
I'd love to just hear from you, like, what do you feel like is the state of that effort and progress that's been made and kind of the next steps there?
Mitch, how many times have we talked about a common grant app? Like, how many times has the sector done that dance?
I
More than
mean,
once.
a lot.
Yeah, a lot. Um, Again, the pandemic raised the twin crises of 2020, raised this profile again. TAG conducted some interesting research last year. Yeah, we talked about at the start, like one of my values is getting things done. That's related to like, stop talking and let's start doing. Last year, I worked with grantadvisor.org to gather 100 forms, grant application forms from 100 foundations, and then analyze their existing level of similarity in grant applications. I worked with this great data scientist, Kwame Porter Robinson, out of University of Michigan, to do some cool similarity analysis. Here's why this matters. The number one pain point, according to a big survey that Grant Advisor did, is the grant form, the inability to download the grant form, the repetitiveness of the questions, so on and so forth. So TAG did this analysis. I know you can't guess at the number because you already know the number, but we tried to figure out what's the level of similarity without even trying between these forms, to try to get the sector to move past this common app question we keep asking and start doing it. 39% similar. So without trying, foundations, their grant application forms were already 40% similar without even trying. So what does that mean? I mean, that means that those 40% of the questions should just be auto-populated somewhere, so that a nonprofit doesn't have to keep entering them every single time, right? Just get them from a shared database like Candid or somewhere else. So we released these findings. We released the set of common forms to the sector about a year ago in August. I don't know if we have made any significant progress. So my question for the sector is, TAG's a tiny org. We're a 3-person organization. We did our job of trying to do the analysis, share some real data with the sector so that they could do something further with it. And I have some concerns about our ability to move this into action. There are efforts. Candid is doing some work here. There are several private sector companies, Impala, Mission Measurement, working on becoming a data commons. Some of them have a related common grant component. There's a philanthropic data commons effort also emerging. I think there might be a common app component there as well. It's been a full year, however, and I wonder, are we able to move past talking about it? I don't know the answer, but I will confess a slight bit of disappointment that we haven't made more progress here, because this was the nonprofit sector's clear. This is one of our biggest pain points.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that, even if it's not like the rosiest outcome we'd love to be shouting from the rooftops, because I think that's another problem with grant applications. And we talked about this last week. We did a community-centric fundraising session with the 2 folks that wrote the annual report that never was. And their whole point was like, think about how much effort we put into like kind of glossing over potential mistakes that were made or things that didn't go according to plan. Everything needs to be sunshine and rainbows, and you have to feel so good about the work the organization's doing at the expense of understanding what it actually takes to make change. So I just wanted to like call that out, that I'm appreciative that you could share it and call out that we haven't made enough progress like we wanted to. Because I think everyone that's listening to this now and in the future likely are in a position that they could help move this forward. So it's important people know if it's not making the progress you want. And I totally hear you on that, like talk to action. What is the motion there? And I think part of even what we came into as Pawn into this sector was it's 10 plus years ago, Dan Pallotta did his TED talk on the overhead myth and why, you know, it was spoiling philanthropy, and got millions of views, and there were billboards about it, and everyone agreed that this is so right. And it's still the #1 complaint I hear from nonprofits using Pawn today. And it begs the question, it's not to discredit, like what Dan did was amazing. It's just like, what is it going to take to move that into systems, right? And actual processes that shift those attitudes. And I think what this is another great example of that. You've done the right first step, and it's about identifying how that gets actioned. And I don't know if you have ideas on what's effective to, it's like the holy grail question, but what do you think, like in general, maybe not that one specific example, but what helps us move from talk and all agreeing on something to making real change?
You know, Mitch, I think you identified it earlier in this call. We talked about the levers. So what are the levers of change for grant makers, the people with the power and the checks? We know it's maintaining, you know, their nonprofit status. We know it's reputational risk. The third one we identified was the rise in the voices of the people we serve. And so for nonprofits here, I would say your voice matters, and it matters now more than possibly ever before. So I think that there are collective calls that Pond can make with Grant Advisor, with N10, with TechSoup, with TAG. I mean, we can put steady pressure on this so that it is a lever with staying power. It's a lever that does continue to move foundations forward. I mean, I still am writing op-eds like once a quarter. I've made a commitment, even as a small nonprofit ED, I've made a commitment to work on an op-ed or a guest blog at least once a quarter so that I can help apply that steady pressure. And so I think your voices matter more than you might realize. And it's in amplifying their import. I think we need to link up with other organizations working on a similar issue and push together. I don't think the moment's passed. I don't. I'm seeing in my inbox, I haven't even read the email yet. I have another invitation to somehow be a part of an infrastructure funding initiative that a lead funder wants to get started. So I know it's making a difference. It hasn't quite turned into full blossomed action yet, but I think it's past incubation and it's getting close. So keep the steady pressure, folks.
You know, and this is just reminding me of what we talked about earlier, the virtues and values in the nonprofit sector that are valuable in other parts of the world too. And one thing that I see is if you're trying to end hunger, you can't wait for hunger to end to recognize progress. And I think that that's a really, like, you have to come up with structures to identify milestones and goals achieved, and like input, like the work you set out to do, like those kinds of progress markers to keep people working at it. To me, that's a really good reminder in this too, because we're talking about the really big systems change where we don't have a lot of levers to change the system. So that's like a really big hurdle to get over. And so I love those examples you gave of like, I still have email in my inbox. And I think I would encourage anyone listening to this too, and I'm saying this out loud to tell it to myself as much as anyone else, of like, keep an eye towards like, what was that nice LinkedIn message you got from someone, or like someone mentioning that the session you did was really helpful, or that they want to, like, those little things really matter, and you're empowering people with those little steps. And I think that's a lot of what your work is doing, even if it's not getting that like big change that we really, really want to see just yet.
Yeah. And you know, Mitch, we can make calls together. I'm going to post something in chat that might be helpful for people to see. But in April 2020, TAG partnered with N10 and I think NetHope to make a call for funding. We made a call to funders for nonprofit tech support right in the early part of the pandemic, April 28th, 2020. And we worked to find out with N10, what were the top needs for nonprofits right now in the very early phase of the pandemic. And then we just made a big, loud call to funders throughout the sector. I think we can keep that up. You know, I think we can do things like do joint op-eds, do short publications that say the state of nonprofit tech right now, 2 years post-pandemic. What are still the most pressing needs? What were they then? What are they now? How can you shift to, general support, or what other modes are there for funding tech? We can keep up this pressure, but I think doing so in partnership is one of the most effective ways for philanthropy to listen.
And that's another great, by the way, lesson. I feel like I need to write like a coffee table book on these lessons I've learned from all the great organizations we work with, but that collective action is so much more powerful than the individualism that we're kind of used to. And I think the nonprofit space and anything that's community-based is such great examples of that. So thank you for sharing another example of that here. I'd love to, just as we're wrapping up here, and invite anyone in the audience. Obviously, Chantal and I could talk all day long about these things because this is what we do day in and day out. But if you have questions too, be sure to give them to us. But I would love to just look forward a little bit with you, Chantal, of like, what are you most excited about? Like if we're having this conversation again, say 5 years from now, like what's your biggest hope of what we're talking about at that point in time?
I have a couple of dreams. I have a couple of hopes. One of the dreams I'm already working on. The other one is kind of just a generalized hope in the world. I mentioned earlier that TAG's mission is the strategic, equitable, and innovative use of philanthropy. The equitable of technology and philanthropy. The equitable part is important to me. So is innovative and strategic, which philanthropy has not always done well, nor funded well for nonprofits. But the equitable use of tech is really important to me. And I think sometimes we have blind spots there around things like maybe we're thinking of using oral reporting, but do we know whether oral reporting, how are we measuring whether oral reporting increases bias once people know your gender, once they know your national origin, whether English is your first language, once they know all this? In the orchestral world, they do blind tryouts with a screen and they have people take off their heels before they walk in, because the minute a reviewer knows their gender, the bias increases in their evaluation. So we don't know, does oral reporting decrease, increase grant renewals? We don't have this data. So it's really important to me that we start thinking about the equitable use of tech in the sector so that we don't make mistakes just patting ourselves on the back and thinking it sounds good. TAG is launching an Equity Essentials for Philanthropy Tech series, tagtech.org/equity essentials, so that we can start to bring an equity baseline to folks working in tech and operations. So I'm really excited about this. And I think for nonprofits, it'll result in a greater awareness of the context within which we use technology and how to use it better. The general hope that I have is, I'm such an intersectionalist. I love teams. We've got people from, all age groups and all demographics, and you've got this creative, innovative stew. We're seeing a leadership change in philanthropy. It's kind of a sea change right now. And so I'm very hopeful that as we see leaders, new leaders coming in philanthropy, even if it's a tech role, a programs role, I'm really hopeful that as we have people who grew up in tech, the digital natives, or people who are aware of what it takes to try to live a mission in 2022, we're going to see a greater respect for your needs, for nonprofits' needs around technology. Inconceivable that you wouldn't be funding tech for a nonprofit in 2022. And I think as we have a leadership change, they will also feel the same way.
And if I could add like my own hopes on top of yours, especially that second piece, is I just think tech should be part and parcel of a nonprofit, because there's this disconnect where we always want people to be like working lean, right, and like getting the most for your dollar. Guess what? That's like all tech is all about efficiency and like getting more out of people's time by making sure they're enabling technology within the organization. And so I agree with you, like 5 years from now, if like nonprofit and tech are somewhat synonymous, as opposed to, something that we have this false dichotomy around, we have huge progress. And I love all of those amazing examples you gave around equity efforts without data and tracking are not equitable.
We don't know if they are. We don't know. We don't know if we're checking a box and trying to make ourselves feel good, or if they're actually helping people. And that's disturbing to me. I have some concerns about that, but I think people are working on it. And we're talking about it right here.
Yeah, and the other piece that you mentioned just around like the creative stew, I just for one can attest to like being a marketplace between vendors to the sector and nonprofits that are their customers, like the amount of innovation I see in people with creative ideas that are like want to get these to market and trying to solve problems all over the place. I think that the more we have a visible marketplace of the needs and like that really showcase how big of a market this is and how much of an opportunity that it is going to spur more and more innovation like this, which I just think is really exciting for the sector. It's not just tech for tech's sake, but those companies to succeed are going to figure out ways to better meet users where they are, be more like effective to the users at these organizations. And I think that's the kind of progress that is going to really help. And then the last piece I just want to make sure we come back to as well is you started off talking about how it's invisible and that's what makes it hard for people. I just think that we can get better at capturing the impact of technology and tech investments. Then you're kind of speaking the language of the funder by making it more visible and systematically lifting up places where tech is having great impact. Maybe even attaching funders' name to it. If it's like about their own vanity, maybe we can play into that a little bit and like position them as innovators if they are funding these successful tech programs.
This CRM system brought to you by Foundation X.
Or just like showcasing when it works. It doesn't need to be about the tool even so much as the user of it, like the organization. I'm just kind of brainstorming now, but I wonder if there's a certain element of like positioning funders as real innovators by virtue of the impact that's achieved at the organization that received their grants. Maybe that's another lever.
That's a fascinating idea. And I think when one's pitching for tech, that's a key suggestion. Make it clear why this investment in tech is a strategic lever within your organization to achieve the mission. That's one of the things we hear from funders. So that's a great suggestion alongside just seeking tech funding as well.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been so generous with your time, Chantal. I really appreciate it. And I know you've just offered so much enlightening insight here and I'm really grateful. For those attending, we have lots of content like this at Pond. A lot of the things we touched on today, trust philanthropy, talking about equity and philanthropy. We're having a session on where white supremacy shows up in philanthropic organizations next Tuesday. So be sure to check out those sessions on our webinar page. We'd love to see you there and feel free to share those within your own networks and communities. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you coming. And thank you so much for joining, Chantal.
Mitch, wonderful. Let's do it again soon.
Please.
Thanks all.